So Charles and I finished the provisional version in 1990. We'd been asked to do so by Universal. Sir Charles had been very interested in From the House of the Dead for many years. He did a wonderful recording in 1982, I think it was, and it was at that stage that I told him that the source that he should be using was not Janácek's manuscript, but the copyist's score. What people didn't quite realise at the time was that the compositional process continued into the copyist's score. Janácek completed his score in manuscript, but then he had two copyists coming to sit with him in his house, and he supervised their copying of the score. And as he did so, he would say, "Oh yes, I think that bit needs a little extra there, let's put in an oboe there, let's do a bit of doubling here, oh no, I didn't mean that." So he made many changes while the process of copying was going on. So if you don't use the copyist score as your basis, you're actually not going to the last stage of the opera that Janácek was involved in. But that wasn't fully realised at the time. We did know that the version issued by Universal Edition in 1930 did not reflect Janácek's ideas for the opera. The score was a very strange looking score, the original manuscript, because he wrote it, unlike all his other operas, not on score paper, in other words printed paper with stave lines where he put in the notes, but just blank bits of A4 paper. He turned round and then wrote all his stave lines there himself. It did mean that he didn't feel the necessity to fill up all the page with lots of instruments, but he simply introduced instruments as he felt he needed them, very economically. So it was, for his pupils at the time, it was a very strange looking score. And I think that may have been the reason why they thought it was a sketch, not a complete version. The fact, it was a great tragedy, he didn't live to see the first performance, because he then would have supervised it in the opera house with František Neumann, had he been alive, and this would have been presented to the public and it would have been published like that. But instead the pupils saw the score, thought this isn't right, and started adding all sorts of things. So in that copyist score written in ink, Oswald Chlubner, one of his pupils, reorchestrated it, putting in lots of extra doublings and things, and doing terrible things like adding a happy ending. Now, the happy ending eventually was left out. I saw the opera in 1964 in Edinburgh, when the Prague National Opera came to Edinburgh, and by that stage they left out the happy ending. But the rest of the score stayed as it was. And the process from then onwards has been trying to get back to Janácek. So when Charles did his recording, we began to take in things that were in the copyist score. And after that, we concluded we needed to do a proper score, which we did in 1990. At that stage, Universal Edition said, "Oh, do we really want House of the Dead now? Janufa, Jej Pastorkynia. It's far more pressing," because that was another Janácek opera which had been completely reorchestrated by someone, Kovacevic, and it would be far, because it was the most profitable opera, the most performed opera, it was important to do that first. So Charles and I got on with Janufa, and it took quite a long time, but it got published in, I think, 1996, and there was a piano vocal score in 2000. And in the year 2000, I had a new job. I became Professor of Music in Cardiff, and it was very demanding on my time. Furthermore, I was writing this big biography. Charles Mackerras, his career had suddenly gone sky high. He was wanted in Berlin and Vienna and lots of places, so he hadn't got the time to devote. And so it wasn't, in fact, till I retired in 2008 that I had the time available to devote myself to the score. By that stage, Charles Mackerras was a very sick man, and he died a couple of years later. I did go with him once with a list of problems, and we sorted those out, but that was the last time he was able to work on it. And the problem with the score was this, that I had at my disposal at my home in Nottingham a photocopy of the copyist score, And there I could distinguish handwritings quite clearly, but it was very difficult to distinguish little things like staccato dots or even slurs and occasional notes, which were in pencil from Klubner, which I didn't want, and the things which were in ink, which I did want. So what I had to do was to go back to the Janácek archive with my score and look directly at their version of the copy of score, and annotate it, saying, oh yeah, this one's right, this one's wrong. And I had many, many trips there. And at the end of it, I was able to feel fairly confident that I had a version in my keeping that directly reflected the copy of score. But that, of course, wasn't the end of the business, because the fact that the opera had not been taken into production by Janácek himself meant that there were many, many loose ends which had to be tidied up. And I had to work very closely with the Universal Edition, lots of things which I think the average person wouldn't quite realise, that Janácek, for instance, asks for 4 flutes, and quite a lot of the time those flutes have to play piccolo, and Janácek doesn't pay any attention. He says, 4 flutes there, next part 3 piccolos. Now, you can't have that. You have to have a period of a few bars where the flutes put the flutes down and take up the piccolos. So you have to do all sorts of little fixes like that. Our provisional version by Mackerras and myself was based on the copy of score. But I should say that there were several passages in it which retained the editions by Klubner. Those were ones which I didn't question, because Charles Mackerras was a very experienced conductor, but I did know that these were added bits, and I wasn't sure whether we should be having them or not. And so for this critical edition, I thought we're not going to have them. And I can give you one very good example. In the second act, between the 2 plays, there is a short section where the convicts start laughing, and they go ha 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 ha, and the basses do it and the tenors do it, and that's it. But the orchestra goes on doing it, and it lasts, I don't know, about 20 bars or so. The orchestra doing it. Now Klubner decided that this wasn't really enough, and that he should involve the whole chorus. So we have soloists and chorus doing sort of polyphonic laughing over what Janácek wrote. And not only is this not remotely what Janácek wrote, but also it does create a problem, because while the orchestra is doing the little laughing stuff in Janácek, there is an announcement by one of the prisoners saying, and now we're going to have the tale of the beautiful miller's wife. So that it goes on over the music. Now, if you're going to have a big laughing chorus over the music, what are you going to do with the announcement? What they did was to take a pause bar at the end and squeeze it in there. And that was their solution. And that was played in all theatres until this particular production. And I was delighted to see that they were using Janácek here, and it really worked very, very well. And I spoke to the conductor, Tomáš Hanus, and he said, oh yes, it's much better having it like that. So I would say another big change, I would say, from the provisional version is that I now took a lot more account of the actual verbal text. As you probably know, Janácek wrote the libretto himself. He'd had his copy of Dostoevsky in front of him in Russian, and he translated as he went along. And in 1927, when he started writing, his Russian wasn't quite as good as it was in 1902 when he last went to Russia. And although he made, I think, a very good job of it, there were words that he put in Russianisms, which he left in, I think, for local colour. There were also quite a few little Moravianisms, and quite a few places where he frankly didn't understand what the words were about at all. Now, because it was essential in theatres in those days before surtitles that singers should enunciate well and all the words should come across and the text should be intelligible as they sang it, Of course, in 1930 they made changes to make the text intelligible to those first Czech audiences. Leaving out, they left in some of the Russianisms, but a lot of the rather odd things were taken out and replaced. And this time I took a very firm decision that our critical edition was going to reflect exactly what Janácek left. All the unintelligible bits, all the Russianisms, the Cranianisms and Moravianisms, and because I felt that those words were important to the soundscape of the opera. They were part of the sound of it. And not to have those Russianisms was wrong. So those are in the score, but because they would create problems for people trying to understand it, I have added to the score quite a long glossary at the end explaining everything. So every funny word has a little asterisk in front of it in the score, and you look at the back of the score and you'll see what Janácek originally wrote, you'll see how that was derived from Dostoevsky, we have a translation, a transliteration, and some sort of comment from me. It lasts 25 pages or so, this commentary, but I think, for the first time, because I really had to look at it hard and get Russianist friends to help me over it, I finally understood quite a lot of what the opera was about, which I hadn't. So that's another major change from the provisional version. The David Pountney production was part of a wonderful cycle of Janácek operas, which was done jointly by Scottish Opera and Welsh National Opera. In those days, David Pountney was the stage director in Scottish Opera, and Richard Armstrong was the conductor here in Wales. And so they did a cycle of 5 Janácek operas, of which this was one. I can't remember which order it was in, but it must go back to the early 1980s, I think. And it was it was one of the most successful of all the 5 operas. And although it's not an opera which gets performed a lot, this was nevertheless revived several times. And it's an extraordinary staging of the opera. I saw it last night in the dress rehearsal, and in between seeing it in the 80s and seeing it now, I've seen many other productions, and it is such a truthful production. The tendency these days is for stage directors to take Janácek's music as it is and then almost write a new story to it, whereas this one really takes a lot of care to try and convey exactly what Janácek wrote. Yeah, look, it's been a long process. I can see that for a publisher, if you've invested a lot of money into a score, the last thing you want to hear is that score is not authentic. You want to go on using that material that you've invested your money in. So it's quite understandable that they just didn't really want to hear about it, and then took their time eventually deciding that they did want to hear about it in case someone else got into it. And now that the Universal Edition have been wonderful in the fact that they have been gradually going over all of the Janácek operas and issuing splendid new critical editions of them all. And it's greatly to their credit as basically a commercial publisher. They've done that. And I've been amazed at the amount of care that I've received from Universal Edition. No effort is too great for them. We have something like 15 different proofs so far of the opera. Okay, little changes here and there, but these days, of course, it's much easier to be able to do that because it's an electronic version, so that you can make changes very, very quickly. Oh, he was wonderful. I'd always heard about him, and I'd been to Brno as a student and studied there for a year and looked at the operas there. And I came back to England, and this is about 1971 or so. And I thought, I must try and make an effort to be in touch with this man, because we've got things in common. So I wrote him a little letter. He was conducting Mackerras at the time, and I wrote him a letter saying, it'd be wonderful if I could meet you. And I expected that I'd get a letter from a secretary, a week later saying, well, Sir Charles will see you on such and such a date. No, the next day the phone rang, and there he was. I couldn't believe that I had the great man at the other end of the phone. He said, well, come along, and if you're coming on this night, come and see me before the performance, we can have a chat. And there he received me. And he was just ever so friendly, and was really interested to hear the sort of work I was doing. And there was one interesting thing that happened then. I was working at that time at the Musical Times, a musical periodical, and there had been a new edition of Janufa, a beautiful looking edition on nice paper, study score, and I wrote a review of it. And I said what a nice looking edition it was, but what a shame that although it had lots of footnotes saying this is what Tyrrell did and this is what Kleiber did, there was no indication that this is what Kovacevic did and it's not Janácek. So I wrote this review, and in the course of our conversation, he said, did you read the review in the Musical Times about the Janufa edition? And I said, well, I wrote it. And he was most intrigued by the fact that the Janufa he was playing was not remotely authentic. And from that moment onwards, he started taking an interest in trying to get an authentic version of the score, which in the end we worked on together. But he was always a conductor who was interested in authenticity. He did lots of authentic Handel and Mozart performances, and he had the same attitude towards Janácek, so he went and studied in the Janácek archive and looked at the originals. What is really remarkable about Charles is, although he was a very eminent conductor, he worked with people like Jiří Zahradka and myself as though we were equals. He was always interested in our opinion, and on the whole, if we said, well, this is what Janácek wrote, he would go with that. I think Jiří's got one instance when Charles really didn't like the original end of Broček and said, I can't do that. But on the whole, he tried to be as authentic as possible, and that was all part of his personality. I think another remarkable thing about Charles is that he was someone, although he was very old when he died, and he kept on conducting, but his interpretations kept on changing. He was someone who always had a score in front of him and kept on noticing new things and trying to do new things. So if you listen to his recordings of almost any work over a number of years, you will find that they vary. And that's, I think, what kept the stuff alive. It was always live music. There are some conductors who I think once they thought the perfect solution for something would go on conducting the perfect solution, and of course it loses its vitality.